All right, I think we're going to go ahead and get started here. So welcome everyone to Redesign, Repurpose, Reskin, Renovate. The learning objectives for this session are shown here, and we'll be following up with a survey and with more information on how to receive credit from AIA. Also, we will collect questions submitted throughout the session in the Q&A box. And if our speaker isn't able to get to all of your questions at the end of the session, we'll have him answer them in writing and we will share them after the teach-in on the website. So my name is Erin McDade. I'm with Architecture 2030 and I will be moderating this session. And it is my pleasure to introduce the speaker for this session, Carl Elefante. Carl Elefante, FAIA, FAPT, is Principal Emeritus with Quinn Architecture, where he served as Design Principal on architecture, preservation, and community revitalization projects. Known for coining the phrase, "The greenest building is one that is already built," Mr. Elefante writes and lectures nationally on historic preservation and sustainable design topics. Mr. Elefante is a fellow of the American Institute of Architects and Association for Preservation Technology. And in 2018, Mr. Elefante served as the 94th president of the American Institute of Architects. Take it away, Carl.
Well, thanks, Erin. And hello again, everyone. I am going to share my screen. And let's see if that actually works again. Seems like it. So hello again, good to be back with you. I'm going to spend the next few minutes talking about the thing that I love the most, which is the privilege of really working with existing buildings and having existing buildings be part of the climate action solution. I'm going to begin with a little bit about me and my work, just to kind of share my perspective a little bit more. So, I've just had the greatest fortune as an architect to get to work on sites all around the United States that are just some of the most beautiful buildings, this incredible built legacy that, we're privileged to get to live in generation after generation. And that perspective of really understanding buildings as legacy and buildings as elements that contribute to so substantially to our culture is really one of the things that I want to bring to this climate action conversation. I also want to say that I'm a child of the 60s, and there seems to be sort of an echo going on in our world today. It feels awfully familiar. It feels an awful lot like 1968 in a lot of ways. And a time full of spectacular promise, just incredible kind of dreams come true, human beings stepping on the moon for the first time, but also a time of just terrible conflict and great concern about what the future really holds. And I'm also very much kind of shaped by the story of the Kennedy era and the kind of Camelot era that Kennedy brought with him to the White House. And his words from his inaugural address are still known pretty well. The "ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country." And that line is actually part of a speech that has resonated with me my whole life. He, as the newly inaugurated president, talked about the hour of maximum danger that he faced becoming the president of the United States. And that was the threat of nuclear holocaust. That the nuclear weapon, the atomic weapons that ended the Second World War, had sort of metastasized into these incredible arsenals of annihilation, and that was the danger that he faced as president. His concern about that was confirmed in fewer than 2 years. Was a Cuban Missile Crisis, where the world was literally on the brink of nuclear war. And he recognized that it was his generation's responsibility to face up to that crisis. They didn't have a choice. Destiny had appointed them to deal with that situation. And we are in a very similar circumstance today. Our hour of maximum danger is climate change. And it's so much easier to see the danger of nuclear holocaust. It's so much more tangible. Climate change is so much harder to get your brain around. It's everything we do. It's everywhere we do it. And that's very difficult, but yet it's our hour of maximum danger. And as Kennedy turned the arms race into the space race, our challenge is to find a way that climate action isn't just something that we're doing because we have to, that destiny requires us to do it, but it's actually the opportunity for us to make the world a better place in so many ways. Of course, at this point, we all share this benchmark of information about the Paris Agreement and the reset moment that we face today. Clearly, Paris let us know just in the clearest terms the risks of climate change and the terms of climate action. Certainly part of that was the COP21 Buildings Day, and that Ed Mazaria played such an important part in, and really laid out the roadmap for what the building sector, both challenges and opportunities are. I think it's also very familiar to us at this point, really what the importance of the building sector is in both direct contribution to greenhouse gas emissions, and then also all of the many associated aspects of it as well. And my own perspective on this is that, well, if the building sector is responsible for 50% of greenhouse gas emissions, the civilization we operate is responsible for 100% of it. And since the building sector is such an important part of shaping that civilization, really, we're responsible for 100% of these global emissions. Let's really work together to address all of them. And the other thing that we came away from Paris with is a very clear idea that the challenges that we're faced with in the building sector are very understandable, very straightforward, and very resolvable. We know what we need to do. And, these three actions of using renewable energy for everything, understanding the carbon emissions from building operations and the carbon emissions from building manufacture and construction, it's very straightforward. We're really getting a very good understanding of each element of this. And I'm going to talk about both operational and embodied carbon and renewable energy as well as we get into the specifics here. And then last but not least on Paris, we also understand that as we're going to COP26 next year, we are really faced with this reset moment, that the goals that were established just 5 years ago are not ambitious enough, and that we must do more, and also that we can do more. And as a building reuse person, I want to spend the next few minutes talking about the importance of reusing buildings and the opportunities that are there. And I'm going to start with a project that I worked on with my colleagues at Quinn that is a poster child of a beautiful historic building. What does a gorgeous historic building like this is the National Academy of Sciences building in Washington, D.C., what does this have to do with climate action? And, the answer is as much as any other building. And so we had the incredible opportunity to really renew this building. It's kind of its 100-year renewal cycle. And part of that was creating some new spaces in what were empty courtyards that were really pretty low quality spaces, and turning them into useful courtyards with skylights capping them. And in those skylights are integrated photovoltaic panels, cells. And this may seem like a small gesture, and in many ways it is, but for the last 10 years, This is where many of the climate scientists come and have conferences in the United States of America. And at every one of those conferences, during their breaks, those climate scientists are standing in spaces that are sending the message that historic buildings, existing building renewal is part of the climate solution. It's an important message, and it's a message that we need to send with every building that we're working with. So how do we do this? How do we deal with carbon in existing buildings? And, again, this is all very familiar at this point, that we're really talking about understanding the relationship between embodied carbon and operational carbon. And as those of us who have been paying attention to Architecture 2030 over the years understand, is that with conventional construction techniques and with conventional building operation performance levels, that embodied carbon and operational carbon over about a 20 or 30-year period are about equal. So they both must be addressed. They're both important parts of the solution. And from the operational side, we really understand the time scale, that the importance of it. And as we move through time, we are expending more and more carbon. And if we create buildings that are more efficient, they expend that carbon more slowly. And that the time scale aspect of operational carbon is very well known and very important. It's the gift that keeps on giving. That efficiency is enormously important. But somewhat less understood is that embodied carbon also has a time scale dimension. And that when we build buildings, they're a complex assemblage of many, many parts. Some of those parts are extremely durable. For example, the building code will require that you build a structure that is earthquake proof and fire proof and storm proof and so on, literally built with materials that will last for hundreds, even thousands of years. What do we think of as we design elements that will last for such a long period of time? Do we really design that into our life cycle thinking? And do we understand the renewal cycles of buildings? And again, this is the time scale that pieces of buildings, some require relatively constant attention, routine attention. Some require attention much more episodically. And over the course, this is a 100-year life cycle that I'm showing here. There are many investments of embodied carbon that happen during that 100-year life cycle. So the time scale of embodied carbon is also something that we can and must design with. When you project this up to what we're really dealing with today with our modern era cities, it begins to give you a sense of the importance of this. The scale is astounding. These photos of the United States' 4 largest cities, there's hardly a building that you can see here that existed before the day I was born, shortly after the Second World War. We've been busy. We built a lot all around the world, and there are cities all around the world that look like those that I showed from the US. I'm going to stay with some US statistics. They're what I'm most familiar with. This is a chart from the United States commercial building stock, the Commercial Energy Consumption Survey, as it's known. And what I want to point out here is that the 2 orange bars are the pre-World War II buildings, those kind of traditional historic buildings that I've made a career working on. And the blue bars are those modern era buildings that were in those photographs of the 4 cities. You can see there's quite a lot of them. In fact, about 2/3 of the existing building stock in the United States of America is from that modern era. Those buildings are very different from the traditional buildings that preceded them. I also would just point out that the projections are that that building stock will double by 2060. And you can see those green bars show what that doubling looks like. You can see that it's a lot of growth, but it's not that different from the growth that's taken place over the last 70 years. So what about those modern era buildings? What are their characteristics? What will it mean for us to be responsible for having to renew and continuing to benefit from the embodied carbon investments that are in those buildings? They're very different from the traditional buildings. In fact, they have received quite a bit of criticism about their lack of performance. My own perspective from having dealt with lots of 19th century and even 18th and some 17th century buildings is that an awful lot was advanced in the modern era, but an awful lot was also forgotten in the modern era. For example, sealed buildings where you can't even open a window on a nice day. And certainly the coronavirus pandemic has shown us that there are some assumptions about depending on buildings and building systems to be operating the way that they're designed that creates a lack of flexibility. So these modern era buildings present some real challenges to us. And I particularly underscore the importance of us getting our arms around this today because we're beginning to see the large scale demolition of modern era buildings. And I have to say that I think it's just terribly wasteful and completely unacceptable. And when we look at the embodied carbon impacts on this, I hope that you'll understand why I think that this is a kind of a criminal negligence to be wasting buildings that have investment that will last thousands of years and tearing them down in decades. So what can we do with those buildings? How can we repurpose them? And the reskinning and the renovation of them is really important elements. So this is a typical Washington, D.C. modern era building intervention. And in the preservation world, many people would look at this and just shake their heads and say, oh, that's not a good approach. I would argue that actually it's a very good approach and that it's actually quite sensible dealing with the realities of modern era buildings. So what do we see here? We see a building that has been stripped of its curtain wall, its skin, basically gutted on the inside with all the partitioning and all of the systems removed. And then all of that replaced with a new generation of material. And if we go back to that life cycle, embodied carbon life cycle diagram, you can see that this is actually, in a way, kind of true to the life cycle expectancy of those elements. That for the curtain wall to still be working, 50 years down the road, that's pretty much an expectable life cycle. And I'll get into a little more detail. I'll show you an example. This is a project that's a Quinn Evans project at Detroit, Michigan. Kind of typical mid-century modern, almost a ho-hum example of a mid-century modern tower. Our firm repurposed it for housing, took an office building and turned it into housing. And the site, minimal work, the structure was kept, required very minimal work. The skin was essentially needing everything. And then of course the services and the space plan and all the furnishings and finishes and so on completely redone to convert it from office to housing. So what you see here is basically a pretty typical formula of the structure is retained, the skin is either upgraded or replaced, and then the interiors are refurbished to make them worthy for whatever the new purpose is that's being done. And the embodied carbon footprint on this, think of this as an investment in repurposing the building, and then also an investment in improving the operational performance of the building. And what you can see here is that the replacement of the skin is a relatively small embodied carbon investment. And here, in terms of the kg CO2 equivalent, it's under 400,000 And by comparison, more than double that, about 2.5 times that, is the embodied carbon footprint to redo the interiors with the new, all the new systems and lighting and, you know, et cetera. And then what I really hope to convey here is just by keeping the structure, just the structure that sounds like, oh, you know, what an empty gesture. That's actually more than double an additional carbon investment footprint that would be needed if we didn't keep that. So I hope that it just gives you a little sense of both the qualitative and the quantitative aspects of why finding ways to reskin, repurpose, and renovate these modern era buildings is so important. And just the last little note on this, there's actually quite a lot of really interesting work that's being done here. These three examples, the Lever House in New York, what you see in this photograph is almost what I just showed you in that in the example in Detroit. You don't really see any original material here. This is all reskin, reclad, much higher performance skin on it. The building in the middle, the Celebrezzi building in Cleveland, Ohio, is overclad. They actually kept the original facade, and then they overcladded it with a second facade. And then the one on the left, the Green Wyatt Federal Building in Portland, Oregon, the new skin is actually solar responsive, climate responsive. So this is the west facade that you're seeing that has a brise soleil with vegetation on it to basically respond to the solar orientation of the building. So recladding can be designed just as much as new building is. So I just want to end with a little more about really how we do this and what both the sort of thinking and practice is that goes behind this. I want to go back and underscore the importance of understanding that buildings are multiple assemblies. They're complex assemblies of many, many different systems. And we need to understand the life cycle of each of those and optimize the life cycle of each of them. The good news is that the tools are here. The protocols, if you will, understanding how life cycle really works and what the impacts of bringing materials to market, using them in buildings, and then maintaining them and even removing them at the end of life. We understand how the life cycle impact really works over time. We also have the tools that allow us to do the necessary analysis to be able to really understand our choices and understand the impacts of our choices over time. I won't go into any detail of all the many tools that do exist, but there are ones that serve many purposes to understand how to benchmark, how to compare and understand our choices, and then ultimately to measure the performance of our design proposals. I want to just give one other little kind of point to detail here. This is carbon for concrete. And what you can see comparing the left and the right diagrams here, charts here, is that cement, which is the gray, is a small portion of the material investment, but it is by far the majority of the embodied carbon investment. So you really have to get into the details of the materiality to understand embodied carbon in building renovation. So how far does this go? Is this really a paradigm shift that informs us about how to think about buildings differently? And I think the answer to that is yes. And it's really bringing, I'll call it, two movements together. The first is understanding the environmental movement. The second is understanding that preserving the built environment, the stewardship of the built environment, was literally a movement from the 60s, just as the environmental movement was. And what it leads us to, I would submit, is that we really have to understand how to value each and every building. This is another project of ours from Detroit. And, the before pictures here, this is an abandoned building, doesn't even have a roof anymore. The windows are all broken out. It's a mess. But we have to learn to love buildings like this. And do they really have value? And the answer is yes. The first is that we can turn them into wonderful places again. And this building actually has a great story as being part of the Harlem Renaissance era in Detroit, an important part of the African-American story in Detroit. And also, these buildings can be green buildings just as much as new buildings can. This is a building, the whole roof is covered with a solar array and ground source heat pumps, et cetera. Existing building rehab and repurposing can be green just as much as new buildings can be. And there's one other thing that I just want to point out here, that our version of what it means to do green building today tends to be very, very, very heavy on the importance of technology. And I accept it. I understand why we have such a fascination in it. But I also would just simply want to point out that it's not the only way to be. It's not the only way to design. And this is my candidate for the greenest building that I knew of, the Pension Building in Washington, D.C., 1887, designed by Montgomery Meigs, who also was a contributor to the Capitol Dome design. This is a building that works with passive, which is absolutely the wrong word for it. It's very active, but passive ventilation, passive daylighting, things that are built into the inherent operation of the building. Open some clear story windows at the top, open your window, and there's, through air stratification, there's natural ventilation that works through the whole building. And, this idea of avoiding systems is actually at the root of the solar design industry that, this guy, Ed Mazzaria, I believe that is with his passive solar design book. This is not a non-modern idea. The systems avoidance, understanding how to work with nature, work with the sun, and not just have technology be the solution to everything, is inherent in modern architecture just as much as it is in traditional architecture. And I want to end with really talking about the kind of Kennedy idea of let's embrace this and let's understand that this is an opportunity for us to make a better world. Just a few months before the Paris summit was held in December 2015, there was another UN, the Sustainable Development Summit, that established the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. Shortly thereafter, the Paris Accord, just about 6 months later, was the Habitat 3 Summit in Quito, Ecuador, where the New Urban Agenda was adopted. So the United Nations, the Paris Accord just fits right in, bookended by these two other similar efforts that basically let us know that the world is becoming an urban world. Today, more than half people in the world live in cities. By the century's end, it's estimated that nearly 9 in 10 people will live in urban areas. So the solution to the humanity's future is the built environment. It's our job. So climate action means that we have to decarbonize everything. It means that we have to do it everywhere. It also then means it will touch the lives of everyone. So everything, everywhere, everyone, it's our opportunity through climate action to make the world a more wonderful place for everyone, everywhere. And it's a new definition of what buildings can do. Buildings can generate power and sequester carbon. Those are certainly the ones that we are focused on as part of the climate action solution. But there are many, many other ways that the built environment can contribute to a better world. And I'll end with noting my favorite quote about building. which is from that famous architect Winston Churchill, which I'm sure a number of you are familiar with him. So first we shape our buildings, thereafter they shape us. And there are many a debate about how literal this is or how figurative it is, but the conditions for human exchange are created by the built environment, by how we make the built environment. Are we going to make them so that it helps us live better lives and helps us have a climate that's a stable and hospitable climate? Or are we going to frustrate those human endeavors? And like Kennedy, I welcome this challenge. It is thrust upon us, but it's our opportunity to decarbonize everything everywhere, and in the process, improve the lives of everyone. Sounds like an awful great thing to be doing as architects and contractors and designers and engineers. And that's the work that we're embarked on. So let's get busy. So that's my story. And I will stop sharing my screen. And Erin, I'd love to address some questions.
Yeah, perfect. We have some time for a few. So I'm going to start with kind of a practical but critical one. I think you have made a really strong case for the carbon benefit of reuse. In your experience, how often do you also need to make a case for the cost benefit? Is there a cost benefit all the time? Is it sometimes a tougher conversation?
Well, there's most of the time, what is really the comparison with building reuse is not, here's this building and now we're going to have a building just like it that we're going to replace it with. It's about replacing a building with a much larger scale building. Okay. So that tends to change the economic formula completely. Okay. So that the question really becomes a kind of a community scale question of how are we accommodating growth? Where are we accommodating growth? How much are we doing with big buildings? How much are we doing with little buildings? The actual building rehab renovation, think about it, you're keeping things, okay? So there's actually lots of inherent economic benefit to keeping existing buildings. There's also economic benefit in the type of work that's done. It tends to be, number one, local. Number two is higher skilled. So a lot of the, oh, that's expensive to work with existing buildings is because of the fact that it tends to be higher skilled. But you're actually also tend to have less work to do because you're keeping things. So the economics of building reuse, one-to-one against new building, because you have that balance of keeping things versus replacing everything, our projects are economically competitive with new building projects. That's why they happen, you know, and so it really does become this question of how does it fit into this larger question of community growth. And a whole other presentation would be on how do you accommodate growth in existing buildings as well. And the answer is you can do that too.
That's fascinating. And you touched on another question, I think, and that's really the value just beyond the one-to-one economics, like you said. I mean, there's this citywide value from an economic perspective, sure, but beyond that. And so I think it's really interesting how you start by talking about the architecture profession's perception of modern era buildings right now, and how there's this kind of sense of like they were just so poorly designed, we just have to start over. And again, you've made the carbon case. Can you expand on how you think the best way for us to restart or reframe that conversation within the design profession is beyond just the carbon case? And I only say that because the carbon case is compelling for most people, but as an entire, I mean, you understand this, to get the whole profession on board, we have to really reshape the entire conversation. So I'm curious what your thoughts on that are.
It's funny, you know, my experience because of literally working with buildings that are 200 years old or 300 years old is that this is a generational thing that what our parents did, oh, it's that old, oh, that junk, that's what our parents did. What our grandparents did, oh, that's so cool, wow, you know, and so we're beginning to see that sort of the Mad Men, you know, era. It's like, oh, that early modern stuff, that's really cool. You know, well, 20 years ago, if you were trying to sell somebody on how cool that early modern stuff was, they would just, oh, that's junk, you know. So there's some of it that just sort of, that just kind of happens naturally as the generations proceed. But I do think that what I can say from my experience of being a building renovator is that the design challenges are fascinating. They're fun. Uh, when the new building projects that I work on, it's like, where's the constraints? You know, I can put columns anywhere that I want to. What's the fun in that? You know, so really working with existing buildings is a design challenge that is just a great deal of fun and an interesting challenge. And it's also something that you get results that are much more complex because there's this interplay between new and old. There's this conversation across generations that you become part of. And you know, for something like that National Academy of Sciences building that I showed you, you know, we're the third generation of architects to work on that building.
Wow.
And you know, that just that sense of continuum, you know, that you know, here's the, you know, Goodhue era, here's the Harrison and Abramowitz era, here's the Quinn Evans era. You know, it's actually wonderful to be part of that continuum. I'll just say one more thing about it. um, how many people get on an airplane to go to a place where they can experience strip malls on Route 1? You know, our cities grow over time. They become more interesting. They become richer, more fulfilling experiences by this layer of time and layer of time and layer of time. Even the most ho-hum building on K Street in Washington, that when you get to repurpose it, you are actually contributing to kind of layering the life of the city in those buildings. So it's just it's a wonderful part of the architectural world of the you know, the urban world.
Yeah, for sure. And if you're also then layering in the element of zero carbon design on top of that, which not only is another design constraint that is a exciting design constraint to work around, but also really speaks to this era, it just becomes all that much more powerful, that layer.
And you know, I have to say that my experience with sustainable thinking and stewardship thinking, and then green building, and then actually decarbonization, you know, that this is, you know, for me, this has been sort of a 40-year process of layering on this awakening to what does being environmentally responsible really mean, okay? And every layer in that has added, has helped me make better buildings. And you know, the window of decarbonization has actually been kind of the ultimate in this process, because you're literally looking at absolutely everything. You're measuring absolutely everything. Every decision is made in the context of the impact on every other decision. It forces a level of integrated design that is just kind of absolute, fully realized integrated design. And again, I feel like it, you know, this is, each part of this path has helped me get to making better and better and better buildings. And you know, now it's not only are they better buildings, but they feel better about the buildings as well. You know, that you really can feel like you've done something good. You know, it's not, oh gosh, I didn't do as much bad. It's no, actually, I've actually done something with this project where I'm contributing to a carbon solution. And, embodied carbon, particularly sequestering carbon, is something that has become my goal. I showed that sort of list of we can generate power, we can sequester carbon, we can grow food, et cetera. Frankly, from the position of an architect, imagine what the future looks like if you are starting every conversation about your building that this is what my building can do to contribute to the green energy solution. And this is what my building can do to contribute to the sequestration of carbon to fight climate change. It's enormously powerful.
Yeah, that's a game changer. Wow, I love that. We don't have too much more time, but it's a 40-year journey you said for you to get here. Do you think that if we focused more on, early education for architects and early professional practice on reuse instead of on new construction, that could be speeded up, that maybe new students today and new professionals wouldn't have to spend 40 years to get here because we don't have 40 years?
Yeah, I think so. And look, to some degree or another, the building stock is going to force us into doing this. That if you just think about, okay, a building gets to be 40 years old or 50 years old, it needs reinvestment. And no matter how the building is built, no matter solid granite building, whatever, 40 or 50 years, it needs reinvestment. So if you just can recall that chart from the Commercial Building Energy Survey, look at all the buildings that fall into that category. We just simply must deal with them, or the windows start to fall out or whatever. And so what that means for the people in architecture school and engineering school today is that the pure economics of how much money will be going into new building versus how much money will be going into renovating buildings, they're becoming quite equivalent. And in some places, sort of the more growth there was in the 20th century, the more renovation there will be in the 21st century. In the US, I've seen studies that have shown that it will be equal and perhaps even more investment in repurposing buildings than in building new buildings over the next 40 years.
Well, that's pretty exciting. I think that's a good place to end on the reuse session. Thank you so much, Carl.
My pleasure. Good being with you again, Erin.